Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Reza Zulkafli dan ini AWANI Global. Kita akan bincangkan berkenaan dengan konsep ASEAN Centrality, susulan daripada satu outlook yang dikeluarkan oleh pemimpin dari negara ASEAN selepas daripada sidang kemuncak ASEAN di Bangkok. Outlook tersebut menyatakan bahawa negara di ASEAN harus kukuh dalam menentang kuasa-kuasa luar tanpa dinamakan siapakah kuasa tersebut, sama ada China, Amerika Syarikat ataupun kuasa-kuasa lain di luar yang cuba mempengaruhi dan juga memecah belahkan kesatupaduan negara-negara ASEAN. Kita ingin melihat kenapa ASEAN penting dalam dunia ketika ini, di mana perbincangan berkenaan dengan penukaran daripada konsep Asia Pasifik kepada Indo-Pasifik dan juga bagaimanakah kedudukan ASEAN sebagai satu wilayah di tengah-tengah kesemua ini harus dikukuhkan. Adakah institusi ASEAN mencukupi pada ketika ini untuk memastikan bahawa ASEAN mempunyai suara yang kuat dalam menentang kuasa luar ini? Untuk membincangkan perkara ini, kita bersama dengan Dr. Marty Natalegawa, bekas Menteri Luar Indonesia. Dr. Marty, thank you for joining us. First of all, let's look at the concept of ASEAN Centrality. Absolutely. And following the outlook that was issued in Bangkok after the ASEAN Summit, what do you make of the ASEAN Centrality, and why is it important for these 10 member states to come together stronger moving forward, especially in the day and age where people are discussing about the dynamics of the region to include or to change the term from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific? Why is the concept of ASEAN Centrality so important right now?
Well, I think the first thing that ASEAN must itself recognize is that ASEAN Centrality must, the idea of ASEAN Centrality must move beyond mantra. It's not sufficient for ASEAN member states to constantly repeat this notion of ASEAN being central to the region's affairs, but it must be earned. Such a role by ASEAN must be earned. It must be earned through its sound policies, sound strategies that provides for the region and beyond. Now, all throughout the recent past, ASEAN has undoubtedly been earning that reputation, that role. We have been able to be proceeding beyond convening power, because no doubt we have been very efficient and very accepted by all in terms of being able to bring all the major powers into ASEAN-led forums and initiatives. But we have been in need to provide intellectual and strategic leadership. But I think this is where the challenge is today. I mean, when we look at the ASEAN so-called Indo-Pacific outlook that had been issued just a couple of days ago, we must really be as ruthless and as candid as possible in looking at the concept, at the outlook. Where is the beef? What actual added value will it be bringing? Are we simply repeating things that we've been saying, or what kind of concrete contributions? And for this, I think only time will tell whether there is a before and an after, because ASEAN must deliver beyond repeating that we are central to our region.
Speaking of before and after, some critics have said that this outlook would be attractive had it been issued 20 years ago. But now, looking at the position of ASEAN in this power struggle, if you may allow me to use that word, between the superpowers, ASEAN should be a bit more stronger. What are some of the mechanisms in place? Will this outlook strengthen the mechanisms or institutions in place in facing this coalition of two big superpowers? What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not privy to the details of how the outlook came about in terms of the talks within ASEAN, but I see at least two dimensions or two sections to the outlook. The first part, the front part, which is the definition of the problem part, I can subscribe and I fully understand the notion of increasing great power competition, the need for ASEAN to manage, consolidate peace, consolidate prosperity. That's the nature of the problem is still, to me, quite sound. What I have a little bit of some question mark is this latter half, when it begins to identify certain steps, certain cooperative areas, where I think here it seems like there is a paradox of plenty. A lot of really detailed intended aspirational cooperation in this Indo-Pacific region is almost like a solution looking for a problem without really addressing the core issue, in my view, of what is prevalent in this part of the world. Namely, like you have said, like ASEAN itself has said, the definition is the problem is the great power, the dynamics, geopolitical shifts. Where is the response to it in the outlook? For instance, is ASEAN going to extrapolate its own Southeast Asia experience to the wider region? The notion of having like a treaty of amity and cooperation amongst the non-ASEAN countries, the idea of having a crisis management capacity in our region beyond having an annual summitry in October or November of the year. In other words, I think having identified in a very sound and a coherent way what the nature of the problems are, the latter part of the outlook risk irrelevance, risk disconnect between the problem and the solution. The solution, the steps identified are, no one can disagree. Sustainable SDGs, connectivities, connecting the connectivities, all these wonderful ideas. But how does it link up to the actual problems? We have now, I think, it's less time for concepts in terms of papers, but we just need to act on them, deliver on our centrality. For instance, just to give concrete examples, developments in Northeast Asia. When you talk about Indo-Pacific, well, the East Asia part, Asia-Pacific part, you can talk of development in Northeast Asia. The monumental shifts that's now potentially taking place on the Korean Peninsula. Is ASEAN present and relevant in that equation? A few weeks ago, there was a development between India and Pakistan. There was some tensions in the two countries' relationship back and forth. Was ASEAN visible and present to manage that conflict situation, potential conflict situations? In other words, we have resolutions or statements or outlook is only aspirational ideas and guidance, but how do we act on it once the dust settles, and is there a before and an after? I think this is where leadership matters by ASEAN member states.
Kita akan berehat seketika, kembali selepas ini. Bertemu kembali. Seterusnya, Dr. Marty, let's look at the elections and how that have forced leaders to be more inward-looking, to get votes. Have they forgotten about ASEAN?
Well, this has been a perennial challenge for many governments in our region. Certainly, the foreign policy institutions, like in Indonesia in the past, we have been trying hard to suggest, to make the case that there is what we call intermestic, international and domestic. The two goes hand in hand, and there is not an either-or proposition, as if you can only do one thing at a time. They must be made to be in synergy. Hence, for instance, when Indonesia went through multi-dimensional crisis in the late 1990s, the political crisis, financial crisis, there was a school of thought at the time to say that Indonesia must concentrate on its internal affairs, consolidate within. We are too consumed within Indonesia to be caring about external developments. But eventually, the school of thought that won over was actually the reverse of that. Precisely because we needed we have such a fragile internal conditions, we need to have a benign regional conditions. Hence, we were far more proactive externally to create that conducive atmosphere. It was the most progressive period for ASEAN's development, the ASEAN community building from 2003 onwards, notwithstanding our own domestic preoccupation. In other words, we synergize domestic and external. And in 2011, there was a school of thought as well that says, well, ASEAN, I'm speaking of Indonesia, Indonesia is limiting Indonesia's capacity, and therefore we must have a post-ASEAN foreign policy, some people say. So what we did then was simply, okay, in that case, we bring ASEAN with us. So we speak of as Balikongko 3, ASEAN community in a global community of nations. ASEAN acting in concert at the global level. In other words, it has been a perennial issue of synergizing national, regional, and global. We can walk and whistle at the same time. But the problem nowadays, I think, we have a predominant school of thought that assumes as if domestic and external is at polar opposites. Transactional even. I'm not speaking necessarily of Southeast Asia, but beyond Southeast Asia, an outlook as if foreign policy must be transactional, mercantilist, more to do with quantitative trade and investment. Very important, but in the end, it has to be beyond this. I think this is a challenge that many of our leaders now face. Yeah.
Are people in ASEAN enjoying the benefits of becoming an ASEAN member? Do you think people understand?
I think ultimately this is the challenge. I mean, I wrote a little book before, Does ASEAN Matter? And the crux of the issue is how can we make the citizens of ASEAN feel the relevance of ASEAN in their day-to-day activities, not simply, it's quite unique. You know, I mean, in Europe, you speak of European community, European Union. But in Southeast Asia, we speak of ASEAN community. It's the community of the organization. So it's not Southeast Asian community. We are very organization focused. So I think we need to make the organization actually deliver. So people can, you know, when it's not just about amongst officials, but they can feel it when they can have ease of travel, when they want to go to universities, schools, there is ease of sharing one another's potentials and etc. So I think in the final analysis, ASEAN must be made more relevant and impactful on the citizens' daily lives. But at the same time, not to go to the other extreme as the Europe has done, because there is, in the case of Europe, I assume Brexit, etc., represents like a backlash against too much Brussels mentality. So we have to find our own equilibrium, the right balance, equilibrium between too much and too little. At the moment, whenever we speak of ASEAN, dissemination about ASEAN, is dissemination about ASEAN as an entity, as its work. I think we need to go back to basics, learn of one another as countries. Indonesians learning more about Malaysia's history, and about Laos and Cambodia. I think sometimes we go straight to the regional level, to the ASEAN as an entity to be disseminated, to be understood, without the prior anchor of knowing one another better as countries, as peoples. Yeah.
Again, briefly, the issue of foreign policy, foreign relations is still a member state issue. Absolutely. And sovereignty has to be respected with regards to this. And there's a lot of benefits that could come from choosing A or B. How would members of ASEAN then decide whether it's for national interest or regional interest?
This is again back to this perennial challenge or tensions that we appear to be facing, as if it's domestic versus external, national versus regional, regional versus global. And this is where we need to be a bit more nuanced and smarter even in promoting the idea of coherence and synergy. For instance, a lot of the problems that we face nowadays, whether it be the haze issues or whether it be the marine pollution issues, they define national solutions, or transnational crimes. There are solutions, there are problems that defies national solutions. They demand partnership. So if we are partnering with our regional neighbors to solve this problem, we are no less nationalistic, no less national interest driven, because it is in our national interest to be cooperating. So we have to avoid the notion as if collaborating and cooperating with our neighbors means less sovereignty. We are actually exercising our sovereignty by trying to solve this problem. So this is, to be honest, it's a very difficult ask nowadays, because nowadays we in the land of, age of Twitter, age of this type of everything must be made bite-sized, simplified, oversimplified even. These are complex issues demanding complex solutions. And sometimes many don't have the patience to actually appreciate how complex these problems are. This is where I think leaders matter. Leaders must inform their public. There are no shortcuts. These are problems that go beyond electoral cycles. It can be solved in 5 years, 10 years. It is a generational thing, and let's have a proper roadmap, and not to be so driven only by one's own political calendar, so to speak. Yeah.
We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll answer these questions. Kita boleh berehat sekali, kembali selepas ini. You mentioned these other regions around the world, because we have to be looking at the realities, the reality right now. And these other regions are also competing for investments. They're also competing for a voice in the global order. Let's go back to that book. Does ASEAN matter, or why ASEAN matters in this global order?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I purposefully asked the question. It is a question rather than a statement. Does ASEAN matter? Because I wish to be as robust and as candid as possible in thinking through, have we actually made a difference, ASEAN, over the past 5 decades and possibly the next 5 decades. And I do detect that there's at least been 3 transformations intra-Southeast Asia. Before ASEAN, Southeast Asia was divided. Post-ASEAN, through ASEAN, we have been more closer as a group of countries in Southeast Asia. It has been transformative between Southeast Asia and the wider region. We were once simply pawns in major power rivalries. Now we have some potential for centrality and shaping and molding role. And we have been transformative in the economic domain in terms of economic transformation, and even arguably in the governance domain as well, but not quite done deal, because the democratic architecture in Southeast Asia, I think, is going through vacillations. But those have been achieved not by accident. It has been through purposeful and deliberate transformative efforts. And this is where I think where we are now. What has been good enough for the past 5 decades may not be good enough for the next 5 decades. And this is where our leaders, once again, are tasked to be a little bit less underwhelming in their ambitions and to deliver. The Indo-Pacific is a great story in terms of the outlook that they managed to adopt. But as I said before, they need to actually go beyond an outlook, beyond a guideline. But because we have plenty of those in ASEAN, shelves, so to speak.
The economic development that we both stated earlier, the increase of GDP from 1.3 trillion in 2007 to 2.8 trillion in 2017, is that enough to make ASEAN matter?
Absolutely. I mean, imagine that. I mean, imagine 600 million odd population of this region having gone through such a transformative economic experience. Of course, we are not perfect. There are still pockets of poverty within countries and between countries. But what we have delivered has been tremendously important. And we need to lock in that process. I'm so encouraged to see in the Indo-Pacific outlook, for instance, the idea of ASEAN engaging with other regions, which is other organizations in Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean areas. Now I'm asking the question, so are we, for instance, going to lift the self-imposed moratorium that we have placed on new dialogue partners? Because, by the way, ASEAN speaks of inclusive outlook, etc. But at the same time, over the past few years, we have put a lid on more dialogue partners because they say they're afraid they'll have more meetings, etc. Well, if you are inclusive, if you are going to be Indo-Pacific in our orientations, we need, first of all, to lift that moratorium, for instance. So ASEAN's economic transformation has been tremendously important. It has mattered, but this we need to constantly reinvent.
Dr. Marty, lastly, we've spoken at length about the progress made by ASEAN, but there are also some challenges and some unresolved issues within ASEAN itself. The issue of human rights, the issue of inequality. How do we address this? Do we have the same formula, the same best practices that we have with regards to the economic development that we can apply to all these other issues, the same motivation?
We have now the three-pillared ASEAN. All the wherewithals are there. Problems that we encounter on poverty, on environment, you name it, is all there. Actually, if anything, we have been so proficient and so effective in identifying the three-pillared ASEAN. The present risk is that the three pillars are not really speaking to one another. Then they are becoming so efficiently siloed. When you look at the ASEAN Vision 2025, for instance, you have the leader statement as a chapeau, and then you have the three pillars efforts, no doubt produced by the different modalities, different processes, that there is hardly any attempt to actually bring them all into one cohesion. We have the ASEAN Coordinating Council that's meant to be doing that work, but I'm not sure what is actually. So in other words, we have almost swung from one pendulum, one side to the other, now recognizing three pillar, but now the three pillar needs to be made a bit more coherent and cohesive. Otherwise, it's just like in splendid isolation, everyone minding their own business. I do my bit, you do your bit, when in fact these issues are very much interrelated. But I am not pessimistic because the obituary on ASEAN has been written many times over. Throughout its history, there have been doomsayers who say, oh, ASEAN, time is done, we are no longer relevant, but we always reinvent ourselves, come back stronger. But knowing what we went through, all those recovery moments came about not by accident. They came about by the exercise of leadership, by the leaders of the region and by the rest of the region. What I fear now is that there could be a sense of complacency built in. So we must realize that this time around, like we did before, we need to deliver and prove wrong those who say ASEAN is no longer relevant.
Do you think ASEAN has strong leaders now?
Well, we have plenty of leaders. We have leaders
strong enough to take ASEAN to the next level.
I'm not sure the term strong is because we have nowadays I'm not talking Southeast Asia. We have all kind of leaders now whose hallmark are supposed to be their country first, etc., etc. I'm not sure what there are leaders and there are leadership. I think ASEAN is in need of cooperative leadership, because if we simply go by strong in the traditional sense and you go by country size, this size, some countries will feel has a less sense of ownership in the ASEAN project. Like in Indonesia's case, because Indonesia is such an obviously large constituent part of ASEAN, in many instances, less is more. In the past, the way I worked has been to create more space for everyone to feel they own ASEAN. It's not just one country throwing its weight around. Exercising restraint, allowing everyone to feel they own the ASEAN project. So, but then again, every episode, every moment has its own different challenges. One can't second guess the problems that our leaders at different time of the era face. But as I said before, I have always the strongest of optimism that ASEAN will be able to continue to be relevant, continue to prevail, and because it has been written off in the past, but I'm sure under the current leadership in ASEAN, we will continue to prosper.
On that note, we thank you very much, Dr. Marty Natalegawa, for being with us today, for joining us today. Itu tadi Dr. Marty Natalegawa, bekas Menteri Luar Indonesia, membincangkan berkenaan dengan ASEAN dan juga sama ada ASEAN masih lagi mempunyai kuasa dan juga sama ada ASEAN penting dalam order baru dunia pada ketika ini. Saya Rizal Sokapli, teruskan bersama kami di Astro AWANI dan ini AWANI Global. Salam hormat.